welcome to Deliberate. Thank you for taking time to watch and to share with as many as you know until it gets to the ends of the earth, blessing and imparting the life of many to the glory of God in Jesus' mighty name. There are times God does not make sense. There are times that God does not make sense. Before you run off with that statement, wait a little. See, those times, there could be days, there could be months, there could be years, and it seems as though God does not make sense. To make sense means to be reasonable and understandable. It means to be reasonable and understandable. So when we say sometimes God does not make sense, it means that there are times that God and his ways are not reasonable to the faculty of man, or the faculty of man cannot understand. The mind of man cannot understand what God is saying or what God is doing, or why God is doing what he is doing or saying what he is saying. So there are times that God does not make sense. God is spirit. That's what the Bible tells us. God is not a spirit, but God is spirit. And you don't expect spirit to make sense to the physical. So God does not live in the sense realm. A man who has sense cannot follow God successfully. So a man who wants to apply his physical senses of seeing, touching, feeling, hearing, like we are taught that we have these senses. Such a man who wants to live in the senses cannot follow God successfully. Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis chapter 12, I'll read from verse 1, the Living Bible. God had told Abram, leave your own country behind you and your own people and go to the land I will guide you to. God did not tell him the land. He said, just start going. I will guide you to the land. That does not make sense. If you do, I will cause you to become the father of a great nation. I will bless you and make your name famous, and you will be a blessing to many others. Verse 3, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and the entire world will be blessed because of you. So Abraham departed as the Lord has instructed him, and Lot went too. Abraham was 75 years old at that time. Who embarks on that kind of a life-changing journey at such an age? Except one who is not walking in the senses. Verse 5, he took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all his wealth, the cattle, the slaves he had gotten in Haran, and finally arrived in Canaan. So Abraham was not in search of a greener pasture because he already had a green pasture. He was already wealthy. He already had his own life made out. He was married. He had slaves. He had employees. He had a household. He had a conglomerate of companies, if that's what you want to call it in today's terms. But then God was telling him, leave all these people and all leave your comfort zone and go to where I will show you. It is not commonsensical to leave certainty for uncertainty. God was asking Abraham to leave what was certain to go into what was not certain. So if Abraham had operated in his senses, he would not have left Haran. So that's why we say sometimes God doesn't make sense. It is against common sense to set out on a journey without destination in mind. But that is how to follow God. Once you are sure it is the word of the Lord, once you are convinced it is the word of the Lord, even when it is not certain, step out. Anyone who wants to walk by sight will miss God. Anyone who wants to walk by sight is going to miss God, because God does not live in the sense realm. You cannot follow God with our physical senses. So anyone who wants to walk by sight will miss God. Genesis chapter 26 from verse 1 to 6, the New Living Translation. A severe famine now struck the land, as had happened before in Abraham's time. So Isaac moved to Gerar, where Abimelech, king of the Philistines, lived. Verse 2, the Lord appeared to Isaac and said, do not go down to Egypt, but do as I tell you. So what did God tell him? Verse 3, live here as a foreigner, that is in Gerar, where he already got to. God saw his intention that he was to go to a place of comfort, to a place of certainty, to a place of provision. And God came to him and said, live here as a foreigner in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. I hereby confirm that I will give all these lands to you and your descendants, just as I solemnly promised Abraham your father. Verse 4, I will cause your descendants to become as numerous as the stars of the sky, and I will give them all these lands. And through your descendants, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. I will do this because Abraham listened to me and obeyed all my requirements, commands, decrees, and instructions. So Isaac stayed in Gerar. It doesn't make sense that there is no food in a place and there's a food somewhere, and then Isaac wants to move to where there is provision, and God says, no, stay where there is no provision. It doesn't make sense. But then, like we said, we cannot use our senses to follow God. So we must realize that there are times that what God says are not reasonable to our human senses, are not understandable by our human senses. And so once we understand that, it helps us to follow the leading of God. So what that means is that when God is giving his leading, when God is speaking to you, your family may not understand it, and so they may speak against it. Your associates may not comprehend it, and so they may mock you. But then we know that God does not live in our senses, in the senses. And so God is spirit, and we must follow him with our spirit. We must not be in a hurry to think all things were convenient for Isaac all through the time he stayed in Gerar. Yes, God told him, don't go to Egypt, stay in Gerar. And when you stay there, I will bless you, I will give you. We must not be in a hurry to think that because you obeyed God, everything was rosy and easy. It wasn't. So that God spoke to you to do something does not mean it will be easy. Does not mean it's going to be comfortable. Does not mean that there will not be challenges. Yes, it's God that spoke to you. And you even stepped out, not leaving your senses. You believe God, you stepped out. That doesn't mean that it will be easy. That doesn't mean to be comfortable. But, being led by God does not eliminate difficulties in all instances. So Isaac faced opposition where God instructed him to stay. It was God that instructed him to stay there. But then he still encounters some challenges. He still encounters some opposition. So you ask. That's why we're saying sometimes God does not make sense. But then we are not looking for God to make sense to us. We are to step up to the standard and the levels of God. We are to come up either to how God operates and walk in the dimensions of God. So I read Genesis chapter 26, verse 12 to 17, still the New Living Translation. So when Isaac planted his crops that year, he harvested 100 times more grains than he had planted, for the Lord blessed him. He became a very rich man, and his wealth continued to grow. He acquired so many flocks of sheep and goats, herds of cattle, and servants that the Philistines became jealous of him. So the Philistines filled up all of Isaac's well with debts. These were the wells that had been dug by the servants of his father, Abraham. You see, God asked him to dwell there. He's dwelling there. Now he's seeing opposition against him there. So Isaac moved away. So verse 16 now. Finally, Abimelech ordered Isaac to leave the country. Go somewhere else, he said, for you have become too powerful for us. So Isaac moved away. So Isaac moved away to the Gerar Valley, where he set up their tents and settled down. So it is God's express instruction for Isaac to settle in Gerar, not to go to Egypt. But we see that as he obeyed God and began to see the result of that obedience, opposition arose. So when God leads you and you see opposition, it may not make sense to you, but just know that these things happen. Sometimes you are required to sing while you are still bleeding. Following God is not a password to a life without suffering. It is not an invitation to a life without tribulation, but it is a call to the abiding presence of God. So sometimes as you are led by God and it's not making sense to you or making sense to people around you, and you have chosen to follow God, and there are either persecutions or difficulties, God still expects you to sing. Sometimes we are required to sing while we are bleeding. We see that in Acts of Apostles chapter 16. That's the story of Paul and Silas. It was God who led them because they have seen the vision of the man of Macedonia asking them to come after several attempts to go to other places, and God gave them that direction to go towards Macedonia. They got there. You will think that they will receive a red carpet reception. But then they are going there, landed them in the prison. Okay, so in verse 22 of Acts chapter 16, verse 22, and the multitude rose up together against them. And the magistrates rent off their clothes and commanded to beat them after they had cast out an unclean spirit from a possessed girl. Okay, so the authority of the land rose up against them and they were commanded to be beaten. And if you understand what beating meant in those days, is not what we have these days. It was whips that had serrating hedges or pricks around them. So they were beaten. Verse 23 now, and when they had laid many stripes upon them, they cast them into prison, charging the jailer to keep them safely, who, having received such a charge, thrust them into the inner prison and made their feet fast in stocks. So he chained their legs. But despite that, in verse 25, we see that, and at midnight, Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises to God, and the prisoners heard them. It doesn't make sense that God led them, and following God's leading, they are in trouble. One would think that since the God and the master of the universe was leading them to go to such a way, he will stop all of such persecution, tribulation, and suffering. So it doesn't make sense that they went through that. He's not appealing to the human psychology or psyche. But we're saying this so that we understand if you are experiencing something like that in your work currently, nothing is wrong with you. We are on the right path as long as you are following God. So at midnight, Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises unto God, and the prisoners heard them. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundation of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's hands were loosed. So one will wonder, why didn't that earthquake happen before they flogged them, so that they will not get to flog them? But that's why we say God doesn't make sense to human reasoning. Why did God allow them to be flogged? Why did God allow them to be put in prison? Why is the earthquake happening after all of that has happened? God is sovereign in all of his ways. We just have to submit to him. And the keeper of the prison, awaking out of his sleep and seeing the prison door open, he drew out his sword and would have killed himself, supposing that the prisoners had been fled. But Paul cried out with a loud voice, saying, do thyself no harm, for we are here. Then he called for a light and sprang in and came trembling and fell down before Paul and Silas and brought them out and said, sirs, what must I do to be saved? And they said, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved and thy house. And they spoke unto him the word of the Lord and all that were in his house. God allowed all of that to happen so that they could win a soul for him. Okay, so you may think, why go through all of that challenges? That's what we are saying, that sometimes the ways of the Lord cannot be comprehend. You cannot comprehend it with the human senses. All good things are not from God, and all things from God may not look good. That's one of the ways you see that the ways of God may not make sense to you. There are things that may be good, but then they are not from God or they are not God. And there are things that may look as though they are not good and they are God. Genesis chapter 45, I want to read from verse 1. That's the story of Joseph. If you remember Joseph, you see that is a man who had different encounters with God. He saw clear pictures of what God wanted to do with his life. It was so clear, it was so vivid, that when he told it to his parents, they could feel it. They could feel the originality of it. His brothers knew that there was something about it. So it was such a commanding vision that God showed him. And yet, God didn't make sense in the way he was to fulfill that vision. Then Joseph could not, I'm reading Genesis chapter 45 from verse 1. Then Joseph could not refrain himself before all of them that stood by him. That was after he had suffered in Egypt. He had become the governor in Egypt. And he cried, "Cause everyone to go out from me." And there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known to his brethren. Verse 2, and he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard. And Joseph said unto the brethren, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. Verse 4, and Joseph said unto his brethren, Come near to me, I pray you. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. How can God give Joseph such a vision of the star, the moon, and the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing down to him, and God still permitted him to be sold? How could God give him a vision of 11 sheaves bowing down to his sheep, and God still permitted him to be sold? Now, therefore, be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves, that ye sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. This is Joseph speaking from understanding. That all the things that are not making sense was God behind the scene sending him to preserve lives. For these 2 years had the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So even the impact of what Joseph did is still being felt today, because there is a nation, Israel. So what God was doing with the life of Joseph that was not making sense was God bringing about a transgenerational preservation. Okay? So the understanding we need to have is such that we do not become bitter, we do not become offended with God as He takes us on a journey. At a point when John the Baptist was in the prison, he had to send some of the disciples to Jesus and ask him, are you the Christ, or we should wait for another? Because it wasn't making sense to him that the Savior of the world that he introduced was there and he was still in prison. Okay? So if God isn't making sense to you right now because of the processes He's taking you through, I beg of you to walk by faith and not by sight, because the ways of the Lord always end in joy. God bless you.